Well, though we're sort of, in a sense, we're dedicating it to Chris Wilkinson, it isn't about Chris Wilkinson. So I'm talking about a range of projects from when we started, or from quite early on when we started working together, to really my life in Wilkinson Eyre, what I've been doing, the projects that I've been involved in. And you'll see that there's a sort of direction of travel, as it were, that this lecture is indicating, this talk's indicating, where I think we should be going. It is the legacy. Of course, it's Chris's legacy, and where we're going to go in the future of architecture, I think, is a bigger question than our practice. It's a huge question. I hope you enjoyed the film. As you can imagine, with Chris passing away unexpectedly in December, this film's rather poignant for us at Wilkinson Eyre. It is, I'm absolutely sure, the last piece of filming that he was involved in. We've been in practice together for almost my entire working life, having also worked together with Chris in a previous practice for a couple of years. And though we dedicate this talk in memory of Chris Wilkinson, this evening I'm going to talk about the projects that I know best, which include some where we've worked together very closely, and then a series of others which I feel tell something of a personal story of life in the office, as well as indicating a direction of travel which presents an exciting challenge in the future. I think our approach to making architecture has evolved considerably. Since our first significant projects in the early 1990s, we definitely emerged from the heyday of high-tech architecture of the late 70s and 80s. And our first project, which is at Stratford Market Depot, was really the first one that got us going, was on the Jubilee Line extension. And we really wanted to make it our ultimate super shed, using the title of Chris's book on the subject. And this was an architecture really of elegant engineering, and it was an unambiguously functional building, really functional. It's about neat geometry and careful detailing, articulating the various components as clearly and as cleanly as possible, all within the framework of very carefully considered proportions. It's occupied by the people who work on the underground trains. The public don't go in, but it's seen from passing trains, so you can see it. We wanted to create a light and airy environment which the operatives would enjoy working in. It's certainly about people-centered design, manifested in that simple belief that as architects we have a desire to please, that we can lift the spirits by creating beautiful and sometimes extraordinary spaces. It was influenced, of course, by Nervi, who did this rather beautiful shed at Orvieto. And we used a diagrid, and you'll see a little bit more of diagrids later. Very complicated things to work on. And light and proportion and V-columns. So we were introducing ideas that we'd sort of been thinking about probably over the years before, but wanted to do in our first shed that was genuinely ours. And then followed by Stratford Station, also on the Jubilee Line. It's the terminus on the Jubilee Line. And as a public building, the design, of course, is driven by passenger experience, combined with that response to some very tricky physical constraints. Also addressing a nascent urban condition to anticipate future growth. And if you go there now, that growth has already happened. I mean, you can barely recognize the place north of the station since its pre-2012 Olympics condition. This is a slide which is quite interesting because this was the brief that we were given, the high-level railways, and then some sort of station with a roof leaning towards the railways, and don't worry about the town off to one side. We didn't spend long thinking that that was a solution, and very quickly came up with the idea of turning it round and trying to make it face south, so people could see this building and it could let the sun stream in. And that idea really generated this form, this sort of almost part of an elliptical form with this light, very sort of simple roof with a very lightweight southern elevation with lots of glass. And the idea really was to get the light to stream in, so that people. Somebody actually said to me they felt like they'd arrived at the seaside when they came off another train out underneath the other railways and appeared in this space. So the sense of arrival was an important thing. I think we'd sort of definitely learnt something about the intricacies of curving geometries from the work on the depot, but here this form was actually also generated by an idea about ventilation, that the air would come in at low level and the whole of the roof acts like a sort of solar chimney and draws air across itself, so that you get a nice gentle breeze in the space itself. And then the idea of contrasting the sort of super lightness of this deep truss and with the cables, and then absolutely almost seamless roof behind, which acts as almost like a giant luminaire. We're bouncing the lights off low level onto the roof and down onto the concourse below. And then, of course, what followed that was this series of bridges, the 5 bridges that we won. This was the first one at South Dock, at Canary Wharf, an unusual one because it had to be in one position and then it had to change and go into another position. And came up with the idea of this thing that could just stretch across on the diagonal, and then you could lose half of it and rotate one of them to the final position. It didn't last very long because they narrowed the dock quite soon after. The second one was this one called the Butterfly Bridge at Bedford. And it was like this because it was very similar to one that was quite nearby, but it kind of opened itself up to create a sort of welcoming space. And then Hume Arch. I think maybe this is the first time anyone tried to put an arch across the diagonal on a bridge. I remember the engineers saying, I'm not sure about that. And when they actually did the calcs, they said, well, actually, it's only 10% more structure in order to do this. But then, of course, it acts as a gateway in both directions, which was really the fundamental idea. And then, of course, the best-known one, which was Gateshead Millennium Bridge. And this one, as you can see, got on the money as well as the postage stamps, which was sort of, a nice feeling, if nothing else. I mean, it was this bridge, I think, has certainly transformed people's perceptions of Gateshead and Newcastle and how they feel about their city. So they are definitely very proud of it. So in a way, the bridge becomes an expression of cultural values and civic pride, and no longer a perfunctory engineering structure. Now, all these projects I've referred to and others give rise to our book, Bridging Art and Science, which Chris and I wrote in the late 1990s. We wrote it together. It contains a series of essays which set out an approach to design, which I think has held good, at least up to now. I mean, maybe it'll hold good for much longer. The confluence of art, technology, and engineering captures our approach to architecture well, I think, and it's our reliance on creativity, observation, and analysis, not forgetting, of course, the laws of physics. The 5th bridge, if it's going to go, there we go, was called the Bridge of Aspiration for the Royal Ballet School in Covent Garden. And it was a competition that we nearly didn't take part in. I was on holiday and the office was busy, so it got turned down when it came in. But when I got back, I managed to get us reinstated and set about trying to find an idea that fitted all the seemingly conflicting constraints. Just to explain, it was raking in plan, you had to not see some neighbour's flat, there were all sorts of things. But somehow something came out of it that spoke of ballet, and I think it was going to win. There was no question. And it leads me to an interest in how we read patterns and geometric forms we can explore that are, of course, enabled by technology, mainly IT, of course, because we can draw them on computer in 3D. The model can be analysed in 3D by structural engineers, and things can be fabricated using machines and equipment fed from 3D computer models. This actually is something I remember doing in the office. It's Guangzhou International Finance Center. How do we get that digrid to work its way around that triangular form in a way that doesn't look squashed in any particular position? And the only way you could do it was to almost take away the entire building and look up the middle of the building to see how all these how that digrid would sort of gradually work its way around. So here was Guangzhou, and you can just see the digrid grinning through the glass. We originally thought that was originally going to be 2 layers with the digrid in the middle, and it got value engineered. But fortunately, you can still just see that digrid. And there it is. It's about two-thirds of it is office, and then 1/3 on the top is the hotel with the extraordinary space up the middle, the atrium space. And somehow we wanted to reflect the digrid that was on the outside on the inside, and was struggling to think of a way of doing it. And then this idea came of expressing it as a series of diamond shapes and just pushing them out. So it got this sort of crinkling effect as you work round. And it does create this extraordinary space. You can hardly see, actually you can just about see at the top of that, there's a little staircase that cantilevers out over the space, not for the faint-hearted, because it's an awfully long way down. Now, another project, which is on this sort of theme of geometry, really, is the Welcome Collection on Euston Road. And the key thing on this project was the staircase. They had a problem that they couldn't get people to go up through the building to see the other exhibits and a library and all the other things that were in there. So they were just concentrating on one floor, going to the cafe and the bookshop, and not really getting any further in. And we had this idea of a staircase which would link up these various spaces along with some other alterations. And it's made out of steel. And actually this is a slightly freer form. It's not purely geometric or rationalized geometry, but and we're rather enjoying the sort of artiness, in a sense, of a freer form as it works its way up. It was an extremely complicated thing to build, but the Welcome Trust was fully behind it, even though it took a little bit longer than we thought it would take. And then we've done many, many bridges, but this is the most recent one in Copenhagen, called Lille Langebro. I mean, Copenhagen is a cycling city, as I'm sure you know. But it just happened that they had this new project, which you can see here on the screen on the left, called Blocks, which is an OMA arts centre. And they wanted to have something that connected Christianshavn with the main part of the city over the harbour, and hence the competition for this bridge. Now, we felt, looking at it, that Copenhagen, things tend to be, the architecture is slender, it's restrained. So we weren't thinking about our sort of, in a way, our more normal, muscular bridges, but something very, very kind of delicate, and to just create a line. And it's very interesting when you look at the city plan, that how this bridge sits on almost one end of a curve of a series of bastions with the moat and so on. So we wanted to in a sense, recreate the memory of what is on the other side from the main city, which is Christianshavn. So Christianshavn is the side with the bastions and the moat. Here's the plan from 30,000 feet or whatever. And when you're on site, you look one way and you're looking back to a tower, which is the city hall, and on the other side there are all sort of wharf buildings. But you're barely aware of this extraordinary space beyond, which is so green and so tranquil and so different from so much of the rest of the city. So we started with this these 2 lines. How thin can we make it? We know it's going to have to be low on the sides, and it'll have to be a bit deeper in the middle just to make the span. And then, of course, the thing had to open as well. So we came up with this idea of these two sort of wings that would come up from low down and then come up high and then go back down again. And then somehow we had to find a way of opening it. So we start with lines. So if you're going to do these curves that have to interact with each other and work, you've got to study them very carefully. So you look along, you draw them. If you draw them in an elevation, they're so flat you can hardly tell what's going on. So you've got to twist them round and you've got to look along them. So we just go through an exercise where we see how do they work with each other, and then how do you combine them to get the form, and then will that form read as a beautiful curve that we're trying to achieve. And it's the curviness of the bridge, I think, that makes people tend to go across it. So this is how it opens. It's a swing bridge. Swing bridges are the most energy efficient way of opening bridges because everything's so perfectly balanced. And I just rather love this picture of the bearing. You can just about see the ladders going down inside it. It's physically quite big. And then the bridge comes along. This is an early rendering. And then here, looking to the southwest, I think it is, to the bridge that's next door, which is a very busy vehicle, motorized bridge, where all the cyclists used to go. Now they can go on this low level. And it is amazing what you can do with steelwork, with structural steel, if you're very, very careful with the right fabricators. You can achieve the curves that you've designed, but you've got to really, really study them carefully to get to what you want. This is just a very short little bit of film. There's something about the atmosphere of Copenhagen that has this rather ethereal quality. At other times, you'll see people, lots of boats, you'll see people swimming at all times of year in the harbour. Now, moving on to another project, which is about these sort of curved forms. So potentially, this was one in competition as well. This is the MCC, Lord's Cricket Ground. Potentially an intimidating brief. Can we increase the capacity of the ground and create more seats either side of Jan Kaplitsky's very well-known media centre, which is a sort of iconic project for Lords. It's a difficult one. And the way we were thinking about it is, I kind of made the association with a classical Palladian villa. This is the Villa Amo at, I'm sure Nicola will recognise this one, at Fanzolo in the Veneto. That you have the central part of the building, you have the wings, and you have little things that pop out at the end. And you have to have that relationship, in a sense, where it's kind of stretched out. And that's where we came from. And that was what, in a sense, we sold to the client. And the key thing about this project is the members, who are a very powerful group, they own the ground, they run everything to do with the ground, are right opposite it. This is what they're looking at. So it had to be right. So we came up with this thing where it's almost like two wings, but they had to be detached. You can imagine if somehow they connected to Jan Kaplicki's form, it just would not work. And we also had to leave a little gap so you could still see the trees through in the gaps. This is the section. They wanted more accommodation, but importantly, in that middle level, they wanted restaurants and the sorts of facilities for the people, for the premium customer, let's call them that, who are paying more for watching the cricket. And on top of it, and the reason I wanted to put it in here particularly, was the idea of this sort of curved canopy-like roof. How could we create a form that had a relationship with the media centre but was not made of the same materials? So this is fabric covered, stretched over steel and timber grid, in fact. And it's kind of evolved from a toroidal form with some moderation, or some alterations to get the exact geometry. And what I rather like is the interplay when you look across these three spaces from one span to the other with the media centre in the middle. The way the sort of curves seem to interact with each other is kind of rather pleasing. And here, just the timber grid above the canopy. It just provides a bit of shelter and a bit of moderation of the environment. And actually, the view of the cricket is fantastic from everywhere, I can tell you that. And this, I think, this might have been a police helicopter, I don't know, but it's looking down on the site. And for those of you who think cricket's boring, they've introduced a new form of cricket called the 100. And there's much more razzmatazz, and it's all over much quicker. Now, just to stop for a moment on Barangaroo and the Crown project, this is really one of, I think, is Chris's great project. We saw it in the film, of the idea of a project that comes from a sculpture, from curving forms, and how you can evolve an idea to become something else into a tower. I'm not going to dwell on it, but, why isn't it going forward? Oh, there we go. And of course, now what's rather sad is that because of COVID, we haven't been able to go there. Chris has not been able to go there and see perhaps his finest work. Now, this sort of subject of nature brings me also onto the subject of regeneration. As we move forward, our concerns around the climate and society's intense use of limited resources in a way that harms our environment means that we need to be less wasteful in every way we can. Construction, I'm sure people know this, is responsible for a staggering 40% of all emissions. So while we're making our buildings more efficient as we move towards net zero, really a complete rethink is needed. We should be seeking to design regeneratively. This isn't easy, but it does suggest that buildings should be designed to be more flexible so that they can be adapted to new uses rather than demolished and replaced with larger, albeit more efficient ones, with nevertheless huge implications in terms of embodied carbon. We've got to place a higher value on the quality of what we design and retain and reuse, even where this may not be obviously economically optimized. This project is in Oxford University, and the last two projects I wanted to show you are about reviving buildings. One is bringing an older library into use, engaging new audiences, and the other a building long fallen out of use where people had almost given up before its regeneration. This is was now called the Western Library. At the time it was called the New Bodleian Library, which is the image at the bottom left that links with these extraordinarily famous and wonderful group of buildings in the heart of Oxford University. Again, one in competition. And we studied, how do these buildings link up with each other? I mean, it is one of the most beautiful groups of urban spaces that I can think of. And the New Bodleian, as it was, kind of strangely turned its back on it. This is the building on the top right is the New Bodleian. And when you look at how they link, it's really interesting, as somebody who likes to rationalize things, that all these things don't quite line up. It's almost like there's a dynamic tension there. You think they're centered up, and there are vistas, but they don't quite line up. And on the right here, you're looking towards, through the Clarendon building, to the door to the New Bodleian, which, when it was only used once, when the building was opened by the king at the time, and never used again. And it is very odd. It's almost, this is a 1930s picture of it recently completed. It's almost as if they didn't want you to go in there. This was a bit, just keep out. There's things going on in here. You don't need to know about it. So the plan on the left that is the basic diagram of the building. The donut building, the middle of the building was stacked full of books, about, I can't remember, 11, 12 or something stories of book stacks, all open to each other with this enormous fire risk. And on the right, our basic diagram, which was to open the facade on Broad Street and to get the public in and make it accessible to people. So this is what it was like before. And then basically we opened it up, created steps, created a frontage, in a sense, made it rejoin Broad Street. It's south-facing even, so people can sort of sit out on the steps. And then created this arcade, and you go into an extraordinary space where there's a kind of raised cloister of books. These are all the open access collections. All the rest of the books are all special collections. These are the super valuable books, and the reading rooms are upstairs. So the public come into this space. There's a cafe. There's extraordinary exhibitions which they have from the collections. So it's really opened it up and made it far more accessible. And then up on the top there's a reading room which actually has, if you step outside it, it's got one of the best views in Oxford, which actually very few people get to see, looking across the roofs toward the Radcliffe camera. And this building was designed by Giles Gilbert Scott, who we come to again And you just note that his sort of trademark, which is these ranks of strip windows like soldiers lined up. And we see that again at Battersea Power Station, where we were asked this. It had already been master planned by Raphael Vinoli, and we kind of picked up his master, or part of his master plan, which is the power station itself, and pretty substantially redesigned it, and have been working on it with a big team led by Sebastian Ricard pretty much ever since, over the last 7 or 8 years. And I rather like this sketch. Chris was involved at the very beginning, particularly, and he starts with a watercolour of the shell of the building, because it had lost its roof back in, many years ago in the 1980s. And one of the sort of exciting things about technology, which you use on this, but also other projects, is this thing called point cloud surveys, which I'm sure people will be familiar with, where you get this extraordinary sort of almost X-ray-like detail in colour of a building, which we found extraordinarily useful. This is the plan of the building, and it divides up into a series of switch houses on either side, a boiler house in the middle, and 2 turbine halls. And just the way it's used, just to explain, at lower level will all be retail, and then the pink is residential, a sliver of leisure in the middle, and then that blue is offices, which are taken by Apple, have taken all of the offices, and then up on the top, residential. And looking at the section the other way, this is a little model we did, which is trying to explain, because that's how we're trying to maintain the scale of the building, keep big spaces open up against the existing facades, and then that central atrium space, probably the biggest atrium anywhere in London, which customers or Apple will enjoy. And just a view of how sort of basic the elevation was, and how, there were windows in it, but not many, and how we reorganized it and brought back the Giles Gilbert Scott elements of the windows, because we needed light, in offices, but also in the residential areas. So just a detail of that. And then the turbine halls, are rendering early on of the turbine halls, and these are beginning to appear, are going through their construction. We're not ready to show you them yet, but just wait. You'll want to visit, I'm sure. And at the southern end, there's a rather extraordinary thing, using the sort of high-tech technology of cable trusses, but to restrain a brick wall all the way up that facade, which I think creates an extraordinary and high space. So various elements of it are actually beginning to appear. And then the other turbine hall, which was built later, is also coming on. And then there's a lobby area, but above this lobby area, I think it's about 50-odd meters high, is the sky, or the roof light, which takes you up to the central atrium of all the office space as we designed it. It won't be quite like this as Apple have it. And then at lower level, in the switch houses, there's various public spaces and routes to get to all the apartments. And then up on the top, the residences, where you're up next to the chimneys, where we created a series of villas, essentially, and gardens that work with the villas. And even on top of the villas, you can get out on your roof. You're quite high up, so it's going to be a little bit windy up there. I just thought I'd show you this to give you an idea of the scale of the chimneys. This is a lobby area in a chimney, so you're only seeing half of it there. So they're big, extraordinary spaces just in the base of a chimney. And one of the sort of great things we managed to persuade them to do, which I think will make them a lot of money as people will want to go up in it, is a ride up in the chimney where you emerge in this glass lift out of the top of one of the chimneys with extraordinary views of London. And then it's gradually appearing more of the little soldier-like windows. Now, it's an interesting question now, is whether we should look harder, I think, at biomimicry when we build and when we adapt, rather than relying on a series of marginal improvements in an attempt to reach net zero. It's clear that a transition to net zero in operational terms is not enough, because the embodied carbon content when we build is so high, almost whatever we do. Alarmingly now, I read that global built mass exceeds global biomass, which is an astonishing statistic when you think about it. So we need to think about a transition to regenerative design. And this is where nature is joint client, no longer the victim or a resource to be exploited, more a case of asking the question, how does nature benefit in this project? And I'm going to leave you with this slide of happy days. Thank you very much.